Hello YouTube! Today I'm going to talk about Puerh tea aging. Well, in this first video I'm going to talk about the processes that allow Puerh tea to age. Basically there are two of them. First you have enzyme oxidation by the enzymes present in the tea leaves, and the second one is oxidation and degradation of the structure by the microorganisms. Okay, let's talk first about the enzymes. Puerh tea is a bit like green tea, but the main difference is that in puerh tea some of the enzymes are still active, right? So why is it so? It's just because the shaching, the kilgreen process, was made in a slightly different way. We didn't cook the leaves as dry. We didn't allow temperature to increase so much in the tea leaves so as to destroy all of the enzymes. And on top of that, the drying was made in the sun and not with hot air. When you dry tea with hot air, you deactivate a lot of the enzymes, because at that time the air is hot, the tea is dry, and under those conditions the enzymes present in tea are very sensitive, are very easily degraded. So since we didn't do that in puerh tea, we can still have a partial oxidation occurring. So let me remind you that in puerh tea we have deactivated most of the enzymes. If we hadn't done that, the oxidation process would go much faster, and the tea would be totally red, probably in a couple of days or weeks. What determines the speed of this oxidation? Well, three parameters: temperature, humidity, and enzyme quantity. So as you can see on this graph, this is a graph of the relationship between temperature and enzyme activity. This was taken in the fresh leaves. Well, we can assume that this diagram is still valid for dried leaves, although it's not 100% sure, but I haven't found any diagram for dried leaves. So as you can see, like the optimal temperature to maximize enzyme activity is about 40 degrees, and below that you have kind of a linear relationship between temperature and enzyme activity, which is surprising because usually most chemical reactions have a kind of an exponential relationship. Like, as a rule of thumb, we say that the rate of reaction doubles every 10 degrees, but enzymes work in a much more complex way than a simple chemical reaction. So that might explain why we have a linear relationship instead of an exponential one. Enzyme activity is influenced by the dryness of tea. The higher moisture content in the tea, the higher the enzyme activity. But I haven't found a nice chart that would illustrate this in an accurate way for tea leaves. And then you have the enzyme quantity. This is a very important point, actually. I found it mentioned in a paper that processing technique actually does have an influence on the aging speed of puerh tea. What I mean by this is, if you gave a strong shaching, for example, a strong kilgreen process, maybe you deactivated a lot of the enzymes, and it means that of course the amount of enzymes working afterwards during the storage time will be lower, and of course that will take more time for the tea to oxidize. Now let me talk about microorganisms. So microorganisms, basically you have fungi and bacteria. The tea is too dry for bacteria to develop in a significant way, so most of the job is done by fungus. So most of the fungi found in puerh tea belong to the Ascomycetes family. They are the ones who have tiny sacs, like little spores that look like tiny mushrooms, that look like small white or blue dots on some puerh cakes. In dry storage conditions, microorganisms won't be able to develop too much because it's too dry. Practically what the fungi do in the tea is that they feed on the tea. They use the carbon from the tea to grow, To do that, usually they release enzymes and they try to dig through the cells. They need to penetrate the cell walls and eat what's inside and dig through the leaves. So they degrade them, they degrade the cell structure. They do this mainly by a chemical way, by releasing enzymes that will break down the cells. And among those enzymes are also some enzymes that will oxidize the polyphenols, just like the enzymes naturally present in the tea. The presence of fungi can allow polyphenols to oxidize thanks to their enzymes, but it also has other effects. Some stuff that the fungi release might have a specific smell, and this is what creates the musty smell of wet stored pu'er tea, that typical smell, whether it's some attic smell or basement smell. What you smell basically is the work of microorganisms and all their metabolites, like all what they produce. In very wet storage conditions, you can have a nasty kind of fungi that grow on the tea and that will have a very disgusting musty smell. Well, the difference between good wet storage and overly wet storage and moldy tea is really in the smell. Like you can easily feel the difference. If the smell is disgusting, then it means that bad fungi has grown on your tea. The presence of tiny white spots on tea can be normal under very humid storage. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tea has turned bad. You will know if the tea has turned bad more by the smell. And sometimes you can have a disgusting smell but no apparent white dots. And sometimes you have white dots but the smell is good. In this case, it's fine to drink the tea. So the heavy presence of fungi in tea is really what makes that special wet stored smell that we can find in tea stored in Hong Kong, Taiwan or Guangdong. But of course you have to be careful with humidity, because if it's too humid you will have that nasty kind of fungi that will grow on the tea. Bacteria can also be found in pu'er tea. So bacteria are much smaller than fungi and they have only one cell, and the cell organization is also different. The major difference between fungi and bacteria is that bacteria requires a wetter environment to grow. So below a certain amount of water in the tea, they won't be able to grow. Now, under most typical storage, bacteria won't be allowed to grow in raw pu'er. But when making ripe pu'er tea, during the pile fermentation process, the bacteria will be allowed to thrive and they will work along the fungi to degrade the tea. An important point about microorganisms growth is that temperature influences the rate at which they will grow, but even at low temperature your tea can turn moldy if it's wet. Now, on a practical side, when you store pu'er tea, you can monitor temperature and relative humidity in the air. I read many papers and I recouped information, and I concluded that below 60% relative humidity there can be no mold growth in tea. So below 60% humidity, only the enzymes will change the tea. Between 60 and 70% relative humidity, most of the fungi won't be allowed to grow. Only the fungi called xerophilic, which means they like dryness, will be able to grow. Microbial activity will have only a very limited influence on the tea. Most of the aging will be due to the enzymes. Above 70% relative humidity, fungi activity increases a lot. Many more species can grow, and then fungi will take a more important role. Then above 80% humidity, you can consider it's a very wet storage, and microorganisms will have a much more important activity compared to the enzymes in the aging process of tea. And then you're quite at risk at that point of having really nasty teas. So you have to be careful when you're at like 80% humidity. Yeah? You can have a look at these charts which show the relative humidity in Beijing, Kunming and Hong Kong along the year. But of course relative humidity can vary a lot depending on your location. These humidities were probably measured at ground floor, and if you live in a high-rise building, as soon as you go above like the 10th floor, humidity decreases dramatically. And if you live by a lake or by a river, that relative humidity is probably higher. Then of course, as you know, relative humidity is affected by temperature. So these measurements were taken outside. If you use a heater or if you use aircon, relative humidity will be lower inside your home. And usually in the wet environment, aircon is used as a way to decrease humidity. I also read in another paper about Indian black tea that it's a problem if your tea is too dry, because if your tea moisture goes below 5%, a lot of volatile compounds will leave the tea, and that will give a stale flavor. And this kind of stale flavor, we can't find it, I think, in overly dried stored cakes, especially like Beijing stored. So be careful also not to have your tea too dry. Then to talk more about the volatile compounds, of course, a tea smells good. It has a natural fragrance. You can smell it in young tea, and this fragrance comes from the leaves themselves, and they slowly evaporate. So it's better to limit the airflow if you want to keep those flavors around the tea, because those are just volatile. They will evaporate. The more airflow you have, the less fragrance you will preserve. Well, when stored by professionals, tea is of course stored in large quantities. So the most common method of storing tea in China is simply to pack it by 6 tons in cardboard boxes. So in one box you have 15 kilo of tea, and you pile them up as much as you can. So you can imagine under those conditions the airflow is very limited, and that will help preserve the amount of volatile compounds, the amount of fragrance, natural fragrance you'll find in the tea. So be very careful as to avoid direct sunlight, because it will damage your tea, and it will probably permanently damage your tea in maybe half an hour, you know. I think the mechanism is if you have direct sunlight striking your Puerh tea cake, first it will heat up. That will lead to more drying, and that might provoke the effect I just mentioned before of having an overly dry tea and the volatile compounds leaving the tea cake and having a stale tea. But what it probably does is it also has an effect with the UV, probably from the sun rays, which damage the cells in other ways. I don't know exactly how that works, but if the tea has been exposed to direct sunlight, it will taste like a very, very green tea. It might have, on the first brew, you might have a very floral fragrance, but then you will have a very stale tea, very bland, with a very light mouthfeel, and almost, like no body in the tea. So, be very careful of sunlight. A limitation on the data I've collected is that that data doesn't come from research on Puerh tea, especially the relation between relative air humidity and moisture content at equilibrium with air. That comes from research on Japanese tea and Indian black tea like broken orange pekoe. Well, those studies show similar data with slight differences, of course, which might be due to the different structure of the leaves. The relationship between relative humidity and moisture content might be different for a cake and for a maocha, and for Japanese tea and for an Indian broken orange pekoe. Unfortunately, I haven't found any research on the subject which uses Puerh tea cakes, and it would be very interesting to do one. But the theoretical results I found are quite in accordance with the empirical data we have. 70% relative humidity is an often cited value when talking about tea storage in China. The influence of temperature on microorganism growth is not clear either. Are there some specific species which are more competitive under certain temperature? That's probably the case, and in that case it would mean that different temperatures would have a different ecosystem in the cake, and then that would probably lead to different kinds of tastes. But this is just speculation because I have no data to support this. So to summarize this video, Puerh tea ages thanks to two things. First, the enzymes naturally present in the tea and the microorganisms. Puerh tea is stored below 70% relative humidity. Enzymes do most of the job of aging, and that means you won't have many musty fragrance due to microorganisms, and you will have more of that natural fragrance of tea which will slowly oxidize. So you'll get from more floral to more fruity tea. When stored above 70% relative humidity, microorganisms will play a bigger role, and then you will have more musty fragrance, more like basement or attic fragrance, which are more related to microorganisms activity. If you're only looking at enzyme activity, the optimal temperature should be around 40 degrees. That's the temperature at which the enzymes work the fastest. And if you want tea to age fast, you have to look at how it was processed. If the Kilgreen process was strong and eliminated most of the enzymes, it will take much more time for the tea to age than if it was not as strong. So when you buy tea, think about whether you want to drink it now or store it for later. If you want to store for later, I wouldn't recommend overly fragrant teas, because overly fragrant teas usually have less enzymes. They are more processed like green teas. In the same way, I wouldn't really recommend overly red teas, because maybe they will age too fast. They will oxidize too fast, and they won't be as rich maybe as like an intermediate version between green and red. And that intermediate version is what we aim for when we are processing our teas. So we do everything so that our teas can age well. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and visit our website. I've put the link of our website and the reference I used to make this video in the video description. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.